Well, good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony. My name's Richard Cruz, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Navy is Lieutenant Commander Peter Bartholomews. We warmly welcome the family of Lance Corporal John Hill, whose story will be told shortly. We're also pleased to acknowledge Senator the Honourable Mr Arthur Sinodinos, representing the Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Bill Shorten, Leader of the Opposition, the Honourable Dr Andrew Leigh, Member for Fenner, Australian Capital Territory, and all invited guests and elders joining us after the ceremony for the official launch of the Four Country, Four Nation exhibition. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. This evening, wreaths will be laid by family and visitors, as well as students, on behalf of the following schools. From Western Australia, Falls Road Primary School, Les Murdy, and from New South Wales, Penrith South Public School. Could I ask you to please stand and join in singing the National Anthem? Students, you may be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and operations over more than a century. But first we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths and floral tributes will now be laid in the following order. The family of Lance Corporal John Hill. Senator, the Honourable Mr Arthur Sinodinos, representing the Prime Minister, and the Honourable Bill Shorten, Leader of the Opposition, and the Honourable Dr Andrew Leigh, Member for Fenner, Australian Capital Territory. Squadron Leader Gary Oakley, National President of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Veterans, and Mr Peter Everly, President, Returned and Services League of Australia, ACT Branch. Uncle Dave Williams, New South Wales President of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Veterans, and Uncle John Snares, representing the Four Country, Four Nation, Elders and Knowledge Holders Group. The Honourable Dr Brendan Nelson, Director, Australian War Memorial, and Brigadier Alison Cray, representing the Chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial. Visitors and students to the memorial will also now lay wreaths.
Today, we pay tribute to Lance Corporal John Hill, who died on active service during the Second World War. A member of the War Dandy Nation, John Hill was born on the 1st of January 1912 in Fremantle, Western Australia, to Arthur and Margaret Hill. The eldest of 9 children, John was followed by Roy, Dorothy, Harold, Edith, Margaret, Isabel, Marjorie and Arthur. Growing up in a weatherboard cottage named Snake Gully in the small seaside town of Bustleton, John and his brothers spent what spare time they could going fishing with their father. In the years prior to the Second World War, John and Roy had saved their money to purchase a Chevrolet truck and found work contracting and wheat carting in the wheat belt area of rural Western Australia. At the outbreak of war, John, Roy and Harold volunteered to serve their nation. John Hill enlisted in the 2nd Australian Imperial Force on the 23rd of October 1940. Harold enlisted in the Royal Australian Navy and Roy enlisted in the Royal Australian Air Force. John Hill was posted to the 2nd 4th Machine Gun Battalion, a support unit for the 8th Division. It was raised in Western Australia and commenced training in Northam Military Camp east of Perth. Hill was assigned to B Company and over the following months attended a number of training schools from which he qualified as a mechanic and transport driver. He was soon promoted to Lance Corporal and assigned as a driver of a Bren gun carrier. In July 1941, the battalion moved to Adelaide and in October to Darwin. Following Japan's entry into the war in December 1941, the 2nd 4th Machine Gun Battalion was sent to join units of the 8th Division, then stationed in Malaya. However, the Japanese attack on New Britain forced the convoy carrying the battalion to travel the long way around Australia, via Sydney and Fremantle. It did not reach Singapore until the end of January. By the time the battalion arrived, the Japanese had captured Malaya and were preparing to invade the island of Singapore. During the ensuing battle for Singapore, Lance Corporal Hill was wounded in the arm and the head. Despite this, he still managed to drive his Bren gun carrier with its dead and wounded crew members back to an aid post. After weeks of fierce fighting, Singapore fell to the Japanese on the 15th of February 1942, and Hill became one of 45,000 Australian and British troops captured in the surrender. He was sent to Selarang Barracks in the large prisoner of war camp at Changi, where he slowly recovered from his wounds. Later, he was moved from Changi to the camp at Adam Park, from where he was employed on work parties around Singapore. In late 1943, Hill contracted dysentery. He was sent to the hospital in Changi, but died from his illness on the 11th of March. He was buried the following day in the AIF cemetery in Changi. Harold and Roy Hill both survived the war. After enlisting in the RAN, Harold had joined the crew of HMAS Perth. He too became a prisoner of the Japanese following Perth's sinking, and narrowly missed meeting up with John when he passed through Changi Camp in October 1942. John had left the Changi camp on a work party only a few days earlier. In fact, it is likely John was working on the wharves when Harold's transport ship docked in Singapore. Harold was put to work on the Burma-Thailand Railway and later wrote a memoir of his experiences. Roy Hill, who had enlisted in the RAAF, became a pilot and an officer in Bomber Command. Serving in Britain, he flew Lancaster bombers for No. 106 and No. 189 squadrons of the Royal Air Force. Following the war's end, John Hill's remains were reinterred in the British and Commonwealth War Cemetery in Kranji, Singapore. The original cross that had marked his grave in Changi was collected by his mates and brought back to Australia. It was later donated to the Australian War Memorial and is currently displayed in the new exhibition For Country, for Nation. The epitaph on his grave in Singapore, chosen by his family, bears the inscription, "His duty nobly done, ever remembered." Lance Corporal John Hill was one of thousands of Indigenous Australians to serve during the Second World War. In honour of the great oral tradition of Indigenous Australians, we tell this story. His name is listed here on the Roll of Honour on my left, among some 40,000 others who died while serving in the Second World War. His photograph is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Lance Corporal John Hill, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. We thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you a very good evening. Thank you.